Well, this is Lecture 25D, Part 1, on the Battle of the Kursk Salient in the ABCs of Communism series that accompanies Volume 7, which will be forthcoming in a couple of weeks. And we have so far gone through Hitler's attack, the Battle of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad, and now we come to Hitler's third attempt at the Battle of the Kursk Salient. And we're going to talk about the humiliating end of Hitler's forces that's underway when the Battle of the Kursk Salient kicks off on July 5th, 1943. Remember that in January 1943, the destruction of the German forces in Stalingrad had been completed. It was all over for Hitler except the fighting, and all over for the Germans except the dying. And that dying they now had to accept. From July 15th through July 13th, 1943, at Kursk, the remaining Nazi cream was ground into hamburger and their tanks into junk. Now that battle actually started on the 5th of July, but reached its climax in those last few days. The Krauts never stopped running until they were dead or encircled in Berlin after Kursk, and all of Eastern Europe was liberated along the way. And we're going to be talking about the Eastern European liberation in the next lecture. Now, I would recommend that you see the documentary videos Great Tank Battles, the Battle for Kursk on the Northern Front, and the Battle for Kursk on the Southern Front, which is now available on the internet, so you can see it there. Now, in 1943, Hitler decides to give it the old college try, but as we're going to see, the third time was not a charm. Now, Hitler was feeling the political heat from the capitalists who had supported him up to this point. They were not well impressed with what he had achieved at Moscow and then Stalingrad, and rumors of his assassination were becoming rampant, despite the best efforts of his equally insane propaganda boss to suppress them. Now, Kursk was his last chance to reverse these fortunes of his war in the East, and although he knew better, he went for it. Now, Stalingrad had broken the back of the Kraut military machine. The coming battle at Kursk in July 43 would destroy the better part of Hitler's remaining European armor force. His Panzer and Tiger tanks were chewed up. As the Battle of Stalingrad ground to its conclusion, the Red Army was moving to a general offensive in the south. This consisted of pressuring the exhausted German forces that had survived the winter. Now, at the end of January 43, a gap of 200 miles wide had opened between encircled Army Group South B and Army Group Don. The advancing Soviet armies threatened to cut off all German forces south of the Don River, including Army Group South A, operating in the Caucasus. Now, Army Group Center had been subject to diversionary attack. That was what had originally been aimed at Moscow. What was left of it had been subject to a diversionary attack with the encirclement of Paulus. But it was coming apart too. Accordingly, Kursk fell to the Soviets on 8 February 1943, and Rostov was liberated on the 14th of February of 43. Now, the Kursk Salient. On 6 February 1943, Manstein met with Hitler at his headquarters in Rastenburg to discuss the proposals he had previously sent. Now, he received an approval from Hitler for a counteroffensive against the Soviet forces advancing in the Donbass region. On 12 February 43, the remaining German forces were reorganized. To the south, Army Group Don was incorporated into what was left of Army Group South and placed under Manstein's command. The unencircled surviving remnants of Army Group South B were placed into Army Group Center. Hitler gave him the 2nd SS Panzer Corps from France that had been refitted and was up to full strength. The tanks of the 1st Panzer Army that had escaped the Caucasus further strengthened Manstein's forces. On the 18th of February 1943, Hitler arrived at the new Army Group South headquarters at Zaporizhia just as the Reds were liberating Kharkov, and he had to run for it the next day. On 28 February 1943, the southern sector of the German front was in crisis as the Reds had created a bulge in Nazi lines. Now, in military terms, a bulge is called a salient. A normal bulge is of tactical import, but the bulge at Kursk was huge. It was a strategic salient. The Red Army's Bryansk, Western, and newly created Central fronts prepared an offensive that envisioned the encirclement of Army Group Center between Bryansk and Smolensk. Now, a Red Army front is what in the U.S. Army would be called an Army group. But at any rate, Manstein's first task was to prevent that from happening. However, even if successful, the salient would still be there, and a jumping-off point for the Red Army in 1943. Hitler and he decided they had to eliminate it. Perhaps in doing so they could regain the initiative and liquidate the main force of Stalin's Red Army. On the 15th of March 43, Manstein's 4th Panzer Army retook Kharkov and then Belgorod on the 18th of March. Exhaustion of both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, coupled with the loss of mobility due to the onset of the spring wet weather, resulted in the cessation of operations for both sides by mid-March. This left a salient extending into the German area of control that was centered around the city of Kursk. The Kraut Plan. On 15 April 43, amid poor weather and with the German forces exhausted and in need of refitting, Hitler issued Operational Order No. 6, which called for the Kursk offensive operation to be codenamed Citadel and to begin on the 3rd of May, or shortly thereafter. For the offensive to succeed, the Kraut High Command considered it essential to attack before the Soviets had a chance to prepare defenses or to launch an offensive of their own. Operation Citadel featured a double envelopment directed at Kursk. Its aim was to surround the Soviet 5 armies and seal off the salient. There would be 2 attacking pincers, one from the north of the salient and the other from the south. Army Group Center would use General Walter Model's 9th Army to spearhead the northern pincer. It would cut through the northern face of the salient, driving south to the hills east of Kursk, securing the rail line from Soviet attack. New Army Group South would use Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, reinforced with the Army Detachment Kempf, to pierce the southern face of the salient. The southern pincer force would drive north to meet the 9th Army east of Kursk. That was their idea. Manstein considered the southern pincer to be his main attack, and it was to be delivered by Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser. The 48th Panzer Corps, commanded by Otto von Kobelsdorff, would advance to the left, while the Army Detachment Kempf would advance on the right. The 2nd Army, under Walter Weiss, would contain the western portion of the salient. Now, on the 27th of April 1943, Model met with Hitler. On his briefing agenda was reconnaissance information, showing the Red Army building with very strong defenses at the shoulders of the salient. Another item showed the Red Army was repositioning its mobile forces in the area west of Kursk. Now, finally, Model said that the longer the preparation phase continued, the less the operation could be justified, and he recommended completely abandoning or radically revising Citadel. Manstein disagreed. On the 4th of May, 1943, a few days later, Hitler called his senior officers and advisors to Munich. Hitler spoke for about 45 minutes, reiterating Model's argument for revising Citadel. Hitler's conception was to wait for new and better tanks. Manstein advocated an early attack with 2 additional infantry divisions. Hitler responded that none were available. Kluge spoke against postponement and discounted Model's reconnaissance materials. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, spoke about the difficulties of rebuilding the armored formations and the limitations of German industry to replace losses. General Heinz Guderian argued against the operation, stating the attack was pointless. The conference ended without Hitler coming to a decision, but Citadel was not aborted. 3 days later, the Kraut High Command decided to postpone the launch date for Citadel to the 12th of June, 1943. Now, on the 10th of May 43, Guderian met with the Little Corporal, asking why do the Kursk thing at all. Hitler remained committed to the offensive, hoping to save German strategic fortunes on his Eastern Front. He now pinned everything on the arrival of new weapons as the key to victory, these being the Panther tank, the Elephant tank destroyer, and the Tiger heavy tank. So Hitler postponed the operation until such time as they could arrive. Now, the real reason behind the Little Corporal's thinking was that he was faced with a near revolt of the capitalists who had been supporting him, and he had to make one more effort in order to gain their continued support to destroy Bolshevism. And so, even though he was afraid of the whole operation, he decided to roll the dice and go for it again. In June of 43, Alfred Jodl, Chief of Staff at Kraut headquarters, called OKW, instructed the Armed Forces Propaganda Office to portray the upcoming operation as a limited counteroffensive. Hitler postponed again to 20 June. Now, on the 17th to 18th of June, following a discussion in which the OKW operations staff suggested abandoning the offensive, Hitler further postponed the operation until the 3rd of July, and finally deciding 5 July as the launch date of the offensive. Now, all of this was being reported faithfully to Stalin by Philby. John Cairncross at Bletchley. Philby was in the 20 or Double Cross Committee in London. John Cairncross at Bletchley Park was the headquarters of the cryptology section, and the Red Orchestra Ring in Germany and the Lucy Spy Network in Switzerland were all giving Stalin the detailed operations of OKW planning. Now, accordingly, Stalin, Zhukov, and Stavka planning staff had been preparing the most extensive receiving positions constructed during World War II. Now, on the 8th of April 1943, Zhukov reported to Stalin, quote, "In the first phase, the enemy, collecting their best forces, including 13 to 15 tank divisions, and with the support of a large number of aircraft, will strike Kursk, using their Kromskom-Orel grouping from the northeast and their Belgorod-Kharkov grouping from the southeast. Now, I consider it inadvisable for our forces to go over to an offensive in the near future. In order to forestall the enemy, it would be better to make the enemy exhaust himself against our defenses and knock out his tanks, and then bringing up fresh reserves to go over to the general offensive that would finally finish off his main force." Now, from the 12th to the 15th of April 1943, Stalin held a planning conference with frontline officers and the general staff. They agreed that the Germans would eventually launch their attack against the Kursk salient. Stalin and Zhukov said the Germans would be drawn into a trap where their armored power would be destroyed. Then the conditions for a major Soviet counteroffensive to expel them from the country would exist. Now, to implement this strategy, they decided to meet the fascist attack by preparing defensive positions that would degrade the Kraut assault forces before launching their own offensive. Thus, preparation of defenses and fortifications began immediately and continued until the Germans attacked in early July. Getting ready. The Voronezh Front Red Army Group, defending the southern face of the salient, was commanded by Nikolai Vatutin. The Central Front Army Group defended the northern face and was commanded by Konstantin Rokossovsky. It was built around the Don Army Group front that had been part of the northern pincer of Operation Uranus that had surrounded the Nazis at Stalingrad. As such, it carried the glory for the destruction of the Kraut 6th Army at Stalingrad. The Steppe Front Red Army Group was in reserve, commanded by Ivan Konev. Now, the Central and Voronezh fronts made three main defensive belts using the labor of 300,000 civilians. The Voronezh and Central fronts dug 2,600 miles and 3,100 miles of trenches, respectively. These were dug in a crisscross pattern for ease of movement. The civilians dug trenches and an interconnected web of minefields, barbed wire fences, anti-tank ditches, anti-tank obstacles, dug-in armored vehicles, and machine gun bunkers. Positioned strategically were deep and wide trenches to hold infantry soldiers. The combined depth of the three main defensive zones was 25 miles. Behind these three main defensive belts were three more belts prepared as fallback positions for soldiers who might be overcome in the first three belts. Of the second belt of three, the first was not fully occupied or heavily fortified. The last two were. Then in the immediate environs of Kursk was a reserve concentration of soldiers and their weapons. Together, the six defensive belts on either side of Kursk were 93 miles deep. Should the fascists manage to break through these defenses, as the Steppe Army Front Group defensive belts would then confront them. These brought the total depth of the defenses to 190 miles. Now, they're not going to make anywhere near that kind of distance, but at any rate, I don't want to get ahead of myself. The Soviets built more than 686 bridges and 1,200 miles of roads within the salient. Red Army combat engineers laid 503,663 anti-tank mines and 439,348 anti-personnel mines, with the highest concentration in the first main defensive belt. The minefields at Kursk achieved densities of 1,700 anti-personnel and 1,500 anti-tank mines per half mile. That was 4 times the density used in the defense of Moscow. The 6th Guards Army of the Voronezh Front was spread over 40 miles of front, protected by 70,000 anti-tank and 65,000 anti-personnel mines in its first defensive belt, and a further 20,000 anti-tank and 9,100 anti-personnel mines in its second defensive belt. Furthermore, mobile obstacle detachments were tasked with laying more mines directly in the path of advancing enemy formations as they moved against the Reds in actual practice. These units, consisting of 2 platoons of combat engineers with mines at the division level and 1 company of combat engineers normally equipped with 500 to 700 mines at the corps level and functioning as anti-tank reserves at every level of command. Now, nearly all artillery, including howitzers, guns, anti-aircraft, and rockets, were tasked with anti-tank defense. Dug-in tanks and self-propelled guns further strengthened the anti-tank defenses. Anti-tank forces were incorporated into every level of command, mostly as anti-tank strongpoints, concentrated on likely attack routes, and the remainder deployed elsewhere. Each anti-tank strongpoint had 4 to 6 anti-tank guns, 6 to 9 anti-tank rifles, and 5 to 7 heavy and light machine guns. These were supported by mobile obstacle detachments as well as by infantry with automatic firearms. Independent tank and self-propelled gun brigades and regiments were tasked with cooperating with the infantry during counterattacks. Now, in June of 1943, Red partisan units attacked Kraut communications and supply lines between Army Group North and Army Group Center, destroying 298 locomotives and 1,222 railway wagons and 44 bridges. In the Kursk sector alone, there were another 1,092 partisan attacks on railways. These attacks delayed the buildup of German supplies and equipment and required the diversion of German troops to suppress the partisans, delaying their training and for the offensive. Now, Central Partisan Headquarters coordinated many of these attacks. In June, Soviet Air Forces, VVS, flew over 800 sorties at night to resupply the partisan groups operating behind Army Group Center. The VVS also provided communication and even daylight air support for major partisan operations. Now, special training was provided to the Soviet infantry manning the defenses to help them overcome the tank phobia that had been evident since the start of the German invasion. Soldiers were packed into trenches, and tanks were driven overhead until all signs of fear among the men were gone. The soldiers called this ironing. In combat, the soldiers would spring up in the midst of the attacking infantry to separate them from the spearheading armored vehicles. The separated armored vehicles were vulnerable to infantry with anti-tank rifles, demolition charges, and Molotov cocktails, and could be disabled or destroyed at direct range. These types of attacks were mostly effective against the Elephant tank destroyers, which lacked machine guns as secondary armament. The soldiers were rewarded 1,000 rubles for each destroyed tank. Now, the Soviets masked the movement of men and materiel, including camouflaging gun emplacements, constructing dummy airfields and depots, generating false radio traffic. Movement of forces and supplies to and from the salient took place at night only. Ammunition caches were carefully concealed to blend in with the landscape. Radio transmission was restricted, and fires were forbidden. Command posts were hidden, and motor transport in and around them was forbidden. According to a Soviet General Staff report, 29 of the 35 major Luftwaffe raids on Soviet airfields in the Kursk sector in June of '43 were against dummy airfields. Thanks to John Caircross, Red Aviation succeeded in destroying more than 500 Luftwaffe aircraft on the ground. The Soviet deception efforts were so successful that the German estimates issued in mid-June placed the Soviet armored strength at 1,500 tanks, vastly underestimating Soviet strength. By now, Red Army armor formations featured its main battle tank as the medium T-34. In the second place were large numbers of the T-70 light tanks. The 5th Guards Tank Army was a typical Red Army armor unit with 500 T-34s and 270 T-70s. In the salient itself, the Soviets assembled a large number of Lend-Lease tanks. Now, the T-34 made up the bulk of the Soviet armor, supplemented by the light T-70s, and the foreign contributions were thrown into the mix. Now, the Voronezh and Central Army Group fronts amassed 1,300,000 men, 3,600 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 2,792 aircraft to defend the salient. This amounted to 26% of the total manpower of the Red Army, 26% of its mortars and artillery, 35% of its aircraft, and 46% of its tanks. In addition, the deeper reserves, organized under the Steppe Front, had at least another 1,000,000 men and 3,000 T-34s. Now we want to turn to the Aggressor order of battle. By February of '43, the Luftwaffe's strength on the Eastern Front had weakened. By the end of June, only 38.7% of the Luftwaffe's total aircraft remained in the East. The Luftwaffe could only achieve momentary local air superiority by concentrating its forces. All German aircraft left on the Eastern Front were slated for Citadel. The strategy of the Kraut Air Force was to gain air superiority, then to isolate the battlefield from enemy reinforcements, and once the critical point had been reached in the land battle, to render close air support. However, in the event, the Red Army equipment reserves were extensive. Luftwaffe commanders realized that its aircraft would be easily replaced, making such raids futile, so this strategy of theirs was abandoned. Previous campaigns had made use of medium bombers flying well behind the front line to block the arrival of reinforcements, but this was rarely attempted during Citadel. Partisan activity behind Army Group Center slowed the rate of resupply and cut short the Luftwaffe's ability to build up essential stockpiles of petrol, oil, lubricants, engines, and munitions. Red Army units had reserves of aircraft that would be used to replace damaged aircraft over the course of the operation. Fuel was the most significant limiting factor for fascist air. To help build up supplies for the support of Citadel, the Luftwaffe greatly curtailed its operations during the last week of June. Despite this conservation of resources, the Luftwaffe did not have the resources to sustain an intensive air effort for more than a few days after the operation began. For Citadel, the Luftwaffe confined its operations to the direct support of the forces on the ground. In this mission, the Luftwaffe continued to make use of the Junkers, Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers with a 3.7 centimeter caliber cannon slung under each wing in a gun pod. Half of the Stuka groups assigned to support Citadel were equipped with these tank busters. The air groups featured the recent arrival of the Henschel HS-129 with its 30mm Mk-103 cannon and the F-subtype ground attack version of the Focke-Wulf 190. In the months preceding the battle, Luftflotte 6, supporting Army Group Center, noted a marked increase in the strength of the opposing Red Air Force formations. These VVS formations they encountered had displayed better training and were flying improved equipment with greater aggressiveness and skill than Kraut Air had seen earlier. The introduction of the Yakov-Lev Yak-9 and the Lavochkin La-5 fighters gave the Soviet pilots parity with the Luftwaffe in terms of equipment. Ominously, large numbers of ground attack Ilyushin-2 Sturmovik and PE-2 were flying for Red Air. Huge stockpiles of supplies and ample reserves of replacement aircraft meant the Red Army and VVS formations would be able to conduct an extensive campaign without slackening in the intensity of their effort. So on the 1st of July 1943, the 9th Army of Kraut Army Group Center, against the northern side of the salient, contained 335,000 men. In the south, the 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf of New Army Group South had 223,907 and 108,000 men, respectively. The 2nd Kraut Army, facing the western side of the salient, had 110,000. In total, the German forces had a strength of 779,000 men, and the 3 attacking armies contained 438,271 combat soldiers. New Army Group South was equipped with more armored vehicles, infantry, and artillery than the 9th Army of Army Group Center. The 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf had 1,377 tanks and assault guns, while the 9th Army possessed 988 tanks and assault guns. In their attack, the Germans used 4 armies and most of their total tank strength on the Eastern Front. German industry had produced 2,816 tanks and self-propelled guns between April and June, of which 156 were Tigers and 484 Panthers. At Kursk, the Krauts used 259 Panther tanks, 211 Tigers, and 90 Ferdinands. The 2 new Panther battalions, the 51st and 52nd, together equipped with 200 Panthers, for which the offensive had been delayed, were attached to the Grob Deutschland Division in the 48th Panzer Corps of Army Group South. Within these 2 battalions, arriving on 30 June and 1 July, the 2 units had little time to perform reconnaissance or to orient themselves to the terrain. Though led by experienced Panzer commanders, many of the tank crews were new recruits who had little time to become familiar with their new tanks, let alone train together to function as a unit. The 2 battalions came direct from the training ground and lacked combat experience. In addition, the requirement to maintain radio silence until the start of the attack meant the Panther units had little training in battalion-level radio procedures. Furthermore, the new Panthers were still experiencing problems with their transmissions, and they proved mechanically unreliable. By the morning of 5 July, the units had lost 16 Panthers due to mechanical breakdown, leaving only 184 available for the launching of the offensive. Now, during all this, our spies are invaluable. One reason the Soviet strategy worked so well at Kursk was because the British had broken the German military cipher using their machine codenamed Enigma, and the project resulting codenamed Ultra. You will recall from Volume 1 that the Poles got one of these from the Germans, and the British got one from them. By the time of World War II, the decryption of Kraut messages provided a clear insight into their wireless communications. The Brits did not give the German order of battle at Kursk to the Russians. Stalin got much of it from Kim Philby, who was on the Double Cross, that is the Roman numeral 20 committee, that handled Ultra, the Enigma source intelligence. The British should have told Stalin everything they knew about the Nazi order of battle, and they did not. Without Philby's input, the outcome at Kursk might not have been as wonderful as it was. Kim Philby had given every detail he could get about how the Enigma decoder worked directly to Stalin as soon as he knew them. Now these details he picked up quickly as the newest MI6 member of the Double Cross 20 committee, and his initial MI6 assignment to the top most secret cryptology section. Therefore, at Kursk, Soviet military intelligence was directly breaking German military communications on the spot because they now knew the Enigma machine and the Allies' ultra secret. John Cairncross got the entire aerial Kursk order of battle for the Luftwaffe via Ultra for the Red Army. Now this allowed our armed forces to launch a preemptive attack on the eve of Kursk, wiping out 500 Nazi warplanes on the ground. For this, he later received the highest award the Red Army could offer. Then, just before the battle against 1 million fascist troops, 70 heavily reinforced Kraut and satellite divisions, the Red Orchestra came through. That spy ring had the detailed jumping off and daily schedule of battle for these troops as planned by the Nazi High Command. So that brings us to the Kraut's jumping off. On the 4th of July 1943, the fighting started on the southern face of the Salient when Kraut infantry attacked high ground for artillery observation posts before the main assault. By 1600 hours, elements of the Panzer Grenadier Division, Group Deutschland, 3rd and 11th Panzer Divisions had seized the village of Butovo and proceeded to capture Gersovka before midnight. At around 22:30, Red General Vatutin ordered 600 guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers of the Voronezh front to bombard the forward German positions, particularly those of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. At Red Army Central Front Army Group headquarters in the south, report of the German offensive in the north arrived. Now, at 200 hours in the morning of 5 July 1943, Zhukov ordered his preemptive artillery bombardment to begin. Simultaneously, Red Army Air used John Cairncross's data to destroy 500 fascist aircraft on the ground. The plan was for artillery and air to disrupt German forces, concentrating for the attack, and it succeeded. Eventually, the Germans began their own artillery bombardment at about 0500. It lasted 80 minutes in the north and 50 minutes in the south. After the barrage, Kraut ground forces attacked with Luftwaffe close air support. In that early morning of 5 July, the VVS, Red Air Force that is, lost 176 aircraft in the south. The losses of the VVS 16th Air Army in the north were less. However, the Luftwaffe lost any hope of air superiority by 7 July, 2 days later, and then the VVS had air superiority for the rest of the operation. At 5:30 on 5 July 1943, following up the preliminary bombardment and Red Army counter-bombardments, the 9th Army opened its attack. 9 infantry divisions and 1 panzer division, with the attached assault guns, heavy tanks, and tank destroyers, pushed forward. 2 companies of Tiger tanks were attached to the 6th Infantry Division and were the largest single grouping of Tigers employed that day. Opposing them were the 13th and 70th Armies of the Central Front. Now, Tigers were just 88 calibered, armored, and motorized artillery, still without slanted protective armor. Thus, they were susceptible to attack by Soviet T-34s that were much faster with heavy cannon. Model's 58th Panzer Corps, supported by 45 Tigers of the attached 505th Heavy Tank Battalion delivered the main attack. Covering their left flank was the 31st Panzer Corps with an attached regiment of 83 Ferdinand tank destroyers. That's Modell's 48th Panzer Corps, I'm sorry. At any rate, on the right flank, 56th Panzer Corps had 4 infantry divisions with 9 tanks and 31 assault guns. To the left of the 51st Panzer Corps was 23rd Army Corps, which consisted of the reinforced 78th Assault Infantry Division and 2 regular infantry divisions. While the Infantry Corps contained no tanks, it did have 62 assault guns. Opposing the 9th Army was the Red Central Front, deployed in 3 heavily fortified defensive belts. Each of those belts had 3 trenches within it. Now Modell chose to try and break through with the Panzer Force and advance toward Kursk. Modell expected to break through on the second day. His corps commanders thought a breakthrough extremely unlikely, and they were right. On the first day, the 48th Panzer Corps penetrated 6 miles into the Red Army defenses before stalling. The 31st Panzer Corps reached the heavily fortified small town of Penry in the second defensive belt, controlling the roads and railways leading south to Kursk. That first day, the Krauts went 5 miles into the Red Army lines for the loss of 1,287 men killed and nearly 6,000 wounded. The 20th Panzer and 6th Infantry Divisions of the 57th Panzer Corps spearheaded the advance. Behind them, the remaining 2 Panzer Divisions followed, ready to exploit any breakthrough. The heavily mined terrain and fortified positions of the Red 15th Rifle Division slowed their advance until 0800 hours, when safe lanes had been cleared through the minefield. That morning, combat intelligence identified a weakness at the boundary of the 15th and 81st Rifle Divisions caused by their preliminary bombardments. The Tigers were redeployed and struck toward this area. Red Army formations then countered with a force of around 90 T-34s. In the resulting 3-hour battle, Red Army armored units lost 42 tanks, while the Germans lost 2 Tigers and a further 5 more immobilized with track damage. However, that fighting delayed the Krauts long enough for the rest of the 29th Rifle Corps of the 13th Army, deployed behind the first belt, to move forward and seal the breach. Red Army minefields were covered by artillery fire, making it hard for the Krauts to clear paths through them. Goliath and Borgward 4 remote-controlled engineered mine-clearing vehicles had limited success. Of the 653rd Heavy Panzerjäger Battalion's 45 Fort Ferdinands sent into battle, all but 12 of them were immobilized by mine damage before 1700, and Hitler's much-lauded secret tank weapon ceased to play a part at all. On the 6th of July of 43, Red General Rokossovsky ordered the 17th Guards and 18th Guards Rifle Corps, with the 2nd Tank Army and the 19th Tank Corps backed up by close air support, to counterattack the German 9th Army. The 16th Tank Corps of the 2nd Tank Army commenced the counterattack at dawn after the preparatory artillery barrage. The 16th Tank Corps, fielding about 200 tanks, attacked the 48th Panzer Corps. They ran into the Tiger tanks of the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion, which knocked out 69 of their tanks and forced the rest to withdraw to the 17th Guards Rifle Corps of the 13th Army. Later that morning, the 48th Panzer Corps responded with its own attack against the 17th Guards Rifle Corps, entrenched around the high ground village of Olkovatka in the 2nd Defensive Belt. That attack commenced with an artillery barrage and was spearheaded by the 24 still serviceable Tigers of the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion, but it failed to break the Red Army defense at Olkovatka and suffered heavy casualties. At 1830 hours, the 19th Tank Corps joined the 17th Guards Rifle Corps, further bolstering resistance. Rokossovsky decided to dig in most of his remaining tanks to minimize their exposure. Penry, defended by the 307th Rifle Division of the 29th Rifle Corps, was also attacked on 6 July. That crowd assault employed their 292nd and 86th Infantry, 78th Assault Infantry, and 9th Panzer Divisions. These Germans were unable to dislodge the defenders from the heavily fortified village. From 7 to 10 July 1943, Bodel concentrated the effort of his 9th Army at Ponry on Okhovatka. In response, Rokossovsky pulled forces from other parts of the front to these sectors. The Germans attacked Ponry on 7 July and captured half of the town after intense house-to-house fighting. A Soviet counterattack the following morning forced the Germans to withdraw, and a series of counterattacks ensued by both sides, with control of the town being exchanged several times over the next few days. By 10 July, the Germans had secured much of the town, but Soviet counterattacks continued. The back-and-forth battles for Ponry and the nearby hill 253.5 were battles of attrition with heavy casualties on both sides. It became referred to by the Red troops as Mini Stalingrad. The War Diary of the 9th Army described the heavy fighting as a new type of mobile attrition battle. German attacks on Okhovatka and the nearby village of Teplo failed to penetrate the Soviet defenses. Even the powerful concerted attack on 10 July by 300 German tanks and assault guns from the 2nd, 4th, and 20th Panzer Divisions, supported by every available Luftwaffe air power in the north, failed. On 9 July, it had become clear to the German commanders that the 9th Army lacked the strength to obtain a breakthrough, but Kluge wished to maintain the pressure on the Soviets in order to aid the southern offensive. Now, while the operation on the northern side of the salient began with a 28-mile wide attack front, by 6 July it had been reduced to 25 miles. The following day, the attack frontage dropped to 9.3 miles, and on both the 8th and 9th of July, the penetrations were only 1 mile. By 10 July, the Soviets had completely halted the German advance. And that brings us to a conclusion of this particular lecture, and we're going to go on to part 2 in the next lecture.